The island waits. January 31, 1944. Dawn breaks across the Marshall Islands in cold gray light. The atoll named Kwajalein sprawls across 93 islands and islets, the largest coral atoll on Earth, cradling a lagoon measuring 839 square kilometers. On this morning, it belongs entirely to the Japanese Empire. 12,000 soldiers have dug into concrete bunkers, constructed pillboxes along the lagoon shore, and positioned anti-tank ditches across the coral sand. They believe this fortress is impregnable. They have heard the propaganda. They have read the orders. They understand their duty. But within 4 days, nearly all of them will be dead. This is the story of how an American Marine with a flamethrower on his back would come to reshape the meaning of the word firepower. For months, American planners had circled this atoll on their maps and spoken of it in whispers. Kwajalein represented something more than an island. It was the first true penetration into what the Japanese called their outer ring, the defensive perimeter meant to protect the empire itself. To capture it, Admiral Raymond Spruance mobilized 85,000 men and 300 warships. The scale was breathtaking. The preparation was methodical. The outcome seemed predetermined to everyone except the men who would have to fight for it. Japan's military leadership believed they had selected wisely. The Japanese High Command had concluded that if Americans invaded the Marshall Islands at all, they would approach from the ocean side, breaching the outer reef. So the fortifications at Kwajalein faced seaward, bristling with coastal defense guns, anti-tank obstacles arranged in killing zones, and hundreds of machine gun positions sited with overlapping fields of fire. The concrete pillboxes were built low and squat, designed to survive artillery bombardment. The anti-tank ditches ran in complex patterns. The beach obstacles, those twisted steel and concrete tetrahedrons and log barricades, formed barriers that stretched from the tideline deep into the lagoon. The Japanese garrison commander, Major General Remiji Ushijima, had overseen these defenses with an eye toward attrition. Every American who landed would face concentrated fire. Every meter gained would cost blood. It was the strategy that had worked at Tarawa. It was the doctrine that Japan's military trusted absolutely: make the landing costly enough, inflict enough casualties, and perhaps the Americans would lose their will to continue. They did not anticipate that American tactics had evolved. They did not understand what was coming across the lagoon. For the Americans had learned from Tarawa. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner and General Holland Smith and the commanders of the 7th Infantry Division had studied the photographs, read the casualty reports, and understood one fundamental truth: the preliminary bombardment at Tarawa had been insufficient. Concrete withstood bullets. It absorbed explosions at a distance. But what if you could pulverize it completely? So the Americans prepared an assault unlike any yet seen in the Pacific War. For 3 days, before the first Marine or soldier even touched the sand, the island of Kwajalein experienced fire on a scale that approached apocalypse. Battleships positioned themselves within a mile of the beach and poured 6,000 tons of shells directly onto the island, more than double what had fallen on Tarawa. Destroyers raked the fortifications with rapid fire. Cruisers added their weight to the bombardment. Army and Navy aircraft dropped bombs continuously, turning the landscape into a moonscape of craters and shattered coral. In total, more than 36,000 rounds of naval gunfire fell on Kwajalein Island alone. American bombardiers released over 15,000 tons of explosives across the atoll. Engineers in forward observation posts reported that the coral itself had been churned to powder in many areas. The beach obstacles were obliterated. The coastal defense guns were buried under mountains of debris. When the bombardment finally ceased, the island was scarcely recognizable. What the Japanese defenders experienced during those 3 days could hardly be called combat. It was annihilation by a force they could not touch, could not see in any meaningful way, and could not escape. They cowered in underground shelters and concrete bunkers, experiencing concussions from nearby impacts that fractured bones, ruptured internal organs, and drove men into states of shock. The psychological effect cannot be overstated. After Tarawa, Japanese military strategists had believed that their coastal defenses could survive any preliminary assault. The experience at Kwajalein proved this belief catastrophically false. And yet, when the Americans finally came, the Japanese soldiers who remained alive, who had not been killed outright by shells and bombs, who had not lost their minds to the relentless percussion of artillery, they did what they had been trained to do. They prepared to fight to the death. On the morning of February 1st, the first waves of Americans began their assault. The 7th Infantry Division's soldiers loaded into landing craft and approached the beaches codenamed Red 1 and Red 2. The Japanese expected this. Their remaining machine guns were positioned to rake the landing craft. Their riflemen waited in intact bunkers. Suicide counterattacks were organized. Ammunition was distributed. Orders were given to hold to the last man. But something fundamental had shifted. The bombardment, despite its titanic scale, had left many Japanese positions intact but severely damaged. More critically, it had created an environment of complete devastation that disoriented defenders and disrupted communication between units. The Americans' assault was met with sporadic fire rather than the concentrated wall of bullets that had greeted them at Tarawa. The landing force advanced inland, clearing bunkers with grenades, rifles, and carbines. But as they moved deeper into the island, they encountered fortifications that conventional weapons could not easily neutralize. Concrete pillboxes with multiple firing ports, underground ammunition storage facilities with connecting tunnels, and tank traps that slowed their advance. Machine gun fire came from positions that had been missed in the bombardment. Casualties began to accumulate. It was at this moment, as American commanders recognized that their assault was not progressing as rapidly as they had hoped, that a new weapon came into the battle. The flamethrower was not new to warfare. Germany had first deployed it in the First World War, and military theorists had understood its potential for decades. But the Americans, through experimentation and hard-won experience, had developed tactical doctrine for the flamethrower that transformed it from an experimental weapon into a system-level assault tool of extraordinary effectiveness. The M2-2 flamethrower weighed 70 pounds when fully loaded. It consisted of two cylindrical tanks carrying thickened gasoline, a pressure system, and a wand-like gun with an ignition mechanism at its tip. When an operator pulled the trigger, the ignition system created a spark, and the pressurized fuel ignited into a stream of flame that traveled nearly 150 feet, clinging to surfaces and burning at temperatures so intense that water had almost no effect. American Marines began moving into positions near the Japanese bunkers. One operator would position himself with a clear line to the firing port or entrance of the fortification. A cover team would establish fields of fire to protect him. Then, the flamethrower operator would approach to within 75 or 80 feet and direct sustained bursts of flame through the opening. What happened inside those bunkers is described in sparse, clinical military reports. The flame entered the confined space, expanded, and filled the chamber with superheated gases. Soldiers sheltering within experienced, in seconds, what could only be described as incineration. But more than that, the psychological effect was instantaneous and devastating. Men accustomed to the concussions of artillery, to the whistle of incoming shells, to the bark of machine gun fire, suddenly faced a weapon that violated every assumption of their defensive doctrine. Concrete was supposed to protect. Underground fortifications were supposed to be safe. These rules had been rewritten by a Marine with a flamethrower. Japanese soldiers who survived the initial wave of flame emerged from secondary exits and connecting tunnels in states that American medical personnel described as various states of distress. Some were burned beyond recognition. Others had inhaled superheated gases that had destroyed their lungs. Many refused to return to underground fortifications, even under direct orders from their officers. One Japanese tactical analysis, preserved in Allied intelligence files, documented the effect with brutal honesty. The analysis stated that flamethrower attacks effectively neutralized bunkers and caused heavy casualties to defenders and confirmed that the psychological impact created terror disproportionate to its actual casualty-producing capability. The document noted that positions attacked with flame frequently surrendered or were abandoned, even when still defensible by conventional standards. But what the Americans realized was that the flamethrower was not just a weapon, it was a system that integrated seamlessly with their combined arms approach. While the flamethrower operators worked, infantrymen with rifles and grenades maintained security. Supporting artillery continued to pound broader areas. Combat engineers, seeing the flamethrower clear a position, rushed forward with demolition charges to permanently destroy the fortification, ensuring the Japanese could not reoccupy it. Over the course of February 1st and February 2nd, American forces pushed across Kwajalein Island. The concrete blockhouses that had seemed to promise survival to their occupants became tombs. Pillboxes that had been constructed with overlapping fields of fire became liabilities as the flamethrower rendered their firing positions irrelevant. Trenches meant to shelter riflemen became death traps when flame poured into them from multiple directions. The speed of the assault shocked even American commanders. The preliminary bombardment had been designed to last 3 days. In the end, it had prepared the battlefield so thoroughly that the actual fighting, while intense and costly in moments, was compressed into a timeframe that surprised no one more than those planning the operation. Kwajalein Island was declared secure on February 4, just 4 days after the assault began. The casualties tell the story in numbers that approach abstraction. Of approximately 5,000 Japanese defenders on the main island, more than 4,800 were killed. An additional 3,500 Japanese died on the northern islands of Roy and Namur, which fell to the 4th Marine Division in similar fashion. In total, approximately 11,000 Japanese soldiers, who had begun the battle fortified by confidence in their defenses and orders to fight to the death, were dead within 4 days. American losses, by contrast, numbered 372 killed and approximately 1,900 wounded across the entire operation. The mathematical disparity is almost incomprehensible. 46 Japanese soldiers died for every American who fell. But the numbers, terrible as they are, mask something more important. They obscure the gap that had opened between what the Japanese military expected the war to be and what the war had actually become. The soldiers who came to Kwajalein had been trained in an ideology of sacrifice and honor. They had been promised that their courage and their willingness to die for the emperor would be rewarded with victories that would exhaust American resolve. They had been assured that Japanese fortifications, properly constructed and properly garrisoned, could not be overcome. What they discovered, in the short span of 4 days, was something entirely different. Consider what the captured Japanese soldiers and survivors told their interrogators. They described arriving at Kwajalein with expectations shaped by military propaganda and the teachings of their superiors. They had been told that American soldiers were soft, that they relied too heavily on machines, that Japanese discipline and courage would eventually overcome American material superiority. They expected hunger because Japanese military doctrine treated hardship as a test of character. When rations were distributed, small portions of rice mixed with barley, occasionally supplemented by dried fish or pickled vegetables, this was considered not deprivation but proof of soldier virtue. A full belly was considered a luxury that only weakened resolve. The initial shelling, the endless bombardment, had been shocking but in a way that could be processed through their existing worldview. Artillery and air attack were expected in modern warfare. But when the Americans finally landed, and when those Marines with the flamethrowers began their work, something broke in the Japanese defensive psychology. The weapon violated every principle of their training. It turned concrete and steel into liabilities rather than assets. It filled bunkers, which were supposed to be places of safety, with fire and suffocating heat. Soldiers who had been willing to charge into machine gun fire, to accept death as preferable to surrender, found themselves transformed into desperate survivors fleeing from flame. A few Japanese prisoners were taken. Of the 5,000 defenders of Kwajalein Island, only 105 were captured rather than killed. These survivors reported to American interrogators a consistent theme: shock at how thoroughly unprepared they had been, not for combat, but for this specific type of combat. One officer, later interviewed, spoke of watching pillboxes, which represented the apex of Japanese defensive engineering, rendered obsolete by a single Marine with a tube on his back. But there was something else in these interrogations, something that American psychological warfare specialists noted with particular interest. The prisoners expressed astonishment at the abundance of American supplies. They had arrived at Kwajalein with a certain number of rounds of ammunition, a specific ration allocation, and orders to make it last. What they encountered, in defeat, was something their propaganda had never adequately prepared them for: the material expression of American industrial capacity. When Japanese soldiers were taken into American holding areas, they were fed American rations. These were not luxuries in the American context, they were standard military issue. But from the Japanese perspective, they were almost incomprehensible in their abundance. Canned meat, vegetables, fruit cocktails, chocolate bars, coffee, and the legendary Spam, that canned pork that would become the symbol of American material superiority across the entire Pacific War. Japanese soldiers who had been conditioned to accept hunger as proof of virtue, who had rationed their small portions of rice with discipline, found themselves in front of American soldiers eating varied meals from metal cans. The symbolism was absolute. It was not just the food itself, though the chocolate and coffee were shocks to systems that had been denied such things for years. It was what the food represented, a nation that could feed its soldiers well while fighting a war across half the world. A nation with such surplus production that even basic rations would seem luxurious to those trained to expect deprivation. One captured soldier, in an interrogation report, asked simply, "How can we defeat a nation that feeds its soldiers like this?" This question captures something essential about what occurred at Kwajalein. The victory was not merely military. It was ideological. It was a collision between two fundamentally different systems of human organization and, more importantly, between two different understandings of what war demanded and what it could achieve. The Japanese military had been founded on principles of sacrifice, discipline, and spiritual will. Officers taught that a soldier suffused with sufficient imperial devotion could overcome any material obstacle. The Americans, by contrast, had been forged in a system that believed in the marriage of material abundance and technological innovation. An American soldier received supplies because he was valuable as an individual, because his nation had the capacity to keep him alive and fighting. The difference was not merely logistical, it was philosophical. The flamethrower, in this context, was not simply a weapon. It was the physical manifestation of American philosophy. It was material abundance converted into tactical capability, industrial production converted into fire and terror, the nation's capacity to manufacture and deliver weapons converted into victory measured in days rather than months. When Admiral Chester Nimitz reviewed the battle reports from Kwajalein, he found his own optimistic timelines exceeded. American planners had expected the capture of the atoll to take weeks. Instead, it had been measured in 4 days. The path to the Philippines seemed suddenly closer. The distance to Japan's inner defensive perimeter seemed suddenly shorter. For the Japanese military command, the implications were catastrophic. They had believed, or had allowed themselves to believe, that their defensive doctrine could achieve what their naval and air forces had failed to achieve, a war of attrition that would exhaust American resolve. But Kwajalein revealed a terrible truth: attrition requires time, and time was something the Americans had in abundance. The island-hopping strategy, which had seemed risky and audacious just months before, now appeared almost inevitable. Each island could be captured not through months of grinding siege but through a formula that was becoming terrifyingly efficient: overwhelming preliminary bombardment, rapid infantry assault, and tactical employment of specialized weapons like the flamethrower to eliminate strongpoints. The formula was being refined with each battle, and each refinement made it more lethal and more rapid. What came after Kwajalein would be Iniwatak, then the Marianas, then Guam and Tinian and Saipan. The flamethrower would be there at each of these battles, evolving into even more specialized forms, mounted on tanks, deployed by engineers in teams, becoming increasingly central to the assault doctrine. Japanese commanders, learning from Kwajalein and the battles that followed, would abandon the strategy of beachline defense altogether. Instead, they would dig deeper, build more elaborate underground fortifications, and attempt to force the Americans to bleed for every island through sheer depth of defensive preparation. But the essential fact would remain unchanged. American material superiority, combined with tactical flexibility and technological innovation, had proven decisive. The flamethrower at Kwajalein was not the end of Japanese resistance in the Pacific. But it was a marker, a moment when it became clear that Japanese military theory, no matter how refined or how fanatically executed, could not overcome the gap between what American industry could produce and what Japanese industry could match. In the months following Kwajalein, American military planning accelerated dramatically. Carrier task forces, amphibious assault squadrons, and supply convoys moved forward at a pace that seemed to violate the laws of logistics. The American Pacific Fleet, supported by an industrial base that produced ships faster than they could be sunk, projected power across distances that seemed almost impossible. The barrier had been broken. The outer ring had been penetrated. Everything else seemed to flow from that moment. The 12,000 soldiers who had fortified Kwajalein with confidence that they would defeat any American assault had been reduced to approximately 1,000 survivors within 4 days. The victory was complete, but it was also something more. It was a demonstration. It showed what American combined arms doctrine, properly executed, properly supported, properly equipped, could achieve against prepared positions defended by disciplined soldiers. It showed that fortifications, no matter how well constructed, could be overcome through the integration of overwhelming firepower, strategic innovation, and specialized assault weapons. It showed, above all, that in a war fought between an industrial giant and a nation stretched to the breaking point, time runs differently. For the Americans, time brought more ships, more troops, more weapons. For the Japanese, time brought only the certainty of eventual defeat. Kwajalein represented not merely a military victory but a crossing of a threshold. Beyond it lay the Philippines, beyond that lay the home islands themselves. The defenders of Kwajalein had hoped to make their stand on that atoll, to inflict sufficient casualties to discourage further American advances, to perhaps buy time for some miraculous reversal of fortune. Instead, 4 days and 12,000 casualties later, they had inadvertently ushered in the final phase of the war. The flamethrower operator who advanced across that coral sand, carrying his 70-pound burden of fuel and ignition, was not conscious of being a symbol. He was a Marine doing his duty, executing tactics that had been refined through blood and learning. But in the mechanics of his assault, in the way the flame cleared a bunker, in the way it transformed a position meant to be impregnable into a vulnerable point waiting to be exploited, he embodied something fundamental about how wars are truly won. They are won through the marshalling of resources, through the relentless application of industrial capacity, through the integration of material abundance into tactical doctrine. They are won by those who can continue producing more weapons, more supplies, more soldiers after the battle is already decided in principle. They are won by those who understand that courage, while essential, is not sufficient when matched against an enemy whose factories can turn out more steel, whose ships can deliver more ammunition, whose organizational systems can process more men through training and replacement. The island of Kwajalein, small and insignificant in the vast expanse of the Pacific, became a monument not to Japanese courage, which was not lacking, but to the triumph of a different kind of strength. Not the strength of the spirit or the willingness to die, but the strength that comes from the ability to make and to sustain. The strength of democracy itself, expressed in the form of industrial capacity and technological innovation, delivered by a nation that believed its soldiers deserved to be fed, supplied, and equipped with the best weapons it could produce. In February 1944, on an atoll in the Central Pacific, that strength proved decisive. And in the 4 days that followed, the war changed in ways that would echo through the rest of the Pacific conflict and beyond, into the post-war world where American abundance would be the dominant fact shaping international order. The flamethrower remains in use today, modified and refined, but fundamentally unchanged in principle. It is a weapon that turns chemical energy into thermal devastation, a tool of intimate destruction. But at Kwajalein, it was something more. It was the sound of an industrial giant asserting its superiority not through ideology or courage, but through the simple fact of material abundance converted into tactical capability. When we examine what occurred on that island in those 4 days, we are not looking merely at a battle. We are looking at the collision of two irreconcilable worldviews, tested against each other in the crucible of modern warfare. And what emerged from that crucible was a truth that no amount of courage or sacrifice could alter. In the 20th century, wars are decided not by the warriors but by the factories behind them. Kwajalein proved this beyond doubt, and in proving it, it helped to shape the trajectory of the entire remaining conflict in the Pacific.